Chapter 9 of The Littles Take a Trip. I'm going to read right in front of my son's guitar. He has a few of them, and maybe at the end I can talk him into playing for you. The Stubby Speck family lived in the lowest branch of a giant oak tree. Steps had been cut into the bark of the great tree. They went around and around the tree trunk until they came to the lowest branch. The stairway looked like part of the tree. The Littles did not even see the stairs until Mr. Speck pointed them out. The Littles followed their new friend up the long stairway. My great-great-granddaddy dug out our 8 rooms in this tree many years ago, said Mr. Speck. Tom pointed to the lowest branch. What's that? He said. What are those round, shiny things in the tree? They're my windows, son, said Mr. Speck. I made them myself from the bottoms of bottles that floated onto the woods on the brook. Wonderful, said Mr. Little. Mr. Speck spoke again. The bark shutters are made so they'll swing shut to hide the windows, he said. Sometimes Henry Big and his friends climb on our tree. When they do, we just shut everything up tight and wait for the boys to go away. Later, the Littles and the Specks had lunch in the largest room of the tree. Sunlight streamed through the colored bottle windows. A long oak table grew right out of the floor. It was part of the living tree. The table was covered with good things to eat in wooden dishes. There was mushroom pie, dandelion green salad, sassafras tea sweetened with honey, and blackberries for dessert. Lucy and Tom sat at one end of the table with the Speck's 2 daughters. The oldest girl, Annie, was a year older than Tom Little. Tom soon found out that Annie didn't know anything. She wanted to know all about Henry Big. She had seen Henry and his friends playing in the woods from time to time. Whenever Tom answered one of her questions, she asked another. Did Henry have a sister? What was his room like? How tall was he really? Finally, Tom said, We don't watch the Bigs all the time. We Littles have lives of our own. The youngest Speck girl, Janie, was Lucy Little's age exactly. They quickly became best friends for life. Oh, you're so lucky, Lucy whispered to Janie, having a sister. I think you're lucky having a brother, Janie whispered back. They both went into a fit of giggling. Mrs. Little was delighted. Uncle Pete spoke. Mr. Speck, I'm astounded by you people and this place of yours. Astounded? Said Mr. Speck. What do you mean? Why, you people live here in the woods winter and summer, said Uncle Pete. And as far as I can see, you don't get any help from anyone. I've been wondering myself, said Mr. Little, how you get along by yourselves. We depend on the Bigs for so many things. Of course, we help them, too. We do electrical repair work in the walls, and we keep the outside water pipes from freezing during the winter. Mr. Little smiled. I suppose the Littles and the Bigs sort of help each other. But you Specks get no help from anyone. How do you do it? I never gave it much thought, said Mr. Speck. I suppose we do it because we have to. He turned to his wife. How do we do it, Mrs. Speck? I think you're right as usual, Mr. Speck, said Mrs. Speck. We do it because we have to. Mr. Speck nodded. Smart woman, he said. We have to work hard, Mrs. Speck went on. There's always winter coming on in the woods. Even in the spring, said Mr. Speck. We're thinking about the next winter. How we've got to do this or we've got to do that before next winter. There's always plenty to do, even for the youngsters, said Mrs. Speck. But we Specks are strong. We love to work. There's one thing that makes everything work out fine, said Mr. Speck. And I know it's the most important thing. Mrs. Speck rapped on the table with her spoon. Attention, everyone, she said. Mr. Speck is talking about something important. I think I know what it is, and I want you all to hear it. Mr. Speck nodded at Mrs. Speck. Thank you, Mrs. Speck. As I was saying, there's no question in my mind but that the most important thing is, he looked around the table, Mrs. Speck's cooking. My wife is a great cook. Everyone laughed. There were shouts of yes, yes, agreed. Stubby Speck held up his hand. I wish you all wouldn't laugh about such a serious thing as cooking, he said. With the good Mrs. Speck's cooking in me, I can do anything, and I mean anything. The Littles and the Specks talked for 2 hours. Even though the two families had never met before, they had much to tell each other. After a while, the Specks knew something of what it was like to live in a house, and the Littles heard and saw for themselves what living in the woods was like. "I'm wondering," said Mr. Little, "why we've never heard there were tiny people living in the woods." "You never got told, that's why," said Mr. Speck. "My great-great-granddaddy used to live in a house just like you folks, but he had 2 of them burned down over his head. The last time he just got up and walked into the woods and never came back." "You told us there were other families living in the woods," said Mr. Little. "How did they get here?" "Kind of the same way," said Mr. Speck. "Every now and then, a tiny family just gets tired of living with big people. There must be something in tinies that makes them head for the woods when they get tired of house living. There hasn't been a new family of tinies come into the woods in 60 years, said Mrs. Speck. She smiled at her guests. House living must be getting better. Finally, it was time to leave. Mr. Speck woke up his skunk. He and the skunk would take the Littles down the path as far as the brook. "That's close to the big people's road," he said. "If you follow the brook the short distance to the road, you can cross over on the bridge." Mr. Speck shook his head. "I won't take you to the road because someone might shoot at my skunk. Some crazy big people will shoot at anything that moves." Mr. Speck went into the woods and found Granny Little's knitting baskets. He helped Mr. Little strap them on the skunk. Granny and Mrs. Little would ride in the baskets again. The Specks and the Littles said their goodbyes. Each family said it would never forget the other. Each promised it would come and visit. Granny Little and Mrs. Little got into their baskets. The rest of the Littles climbed up on the skunk's broad back. Stubby Speck said something in the skunk's ear, and the animal walked slowly off through the underbrush. The two families waved until they were out of sight. Mr. Speck pointed out the interesting things to look at on the trip. The last of the daylilies were in bloom. They were like bright orange lights in the sunny places of the woods. A maple tree was the home of another tiny family. Animals got out of the way quickly when they saw the skunk. They came to the brook. It was about 4 feet wide and 10 inches deep. The water moved swiftly. The Littles could see the bridge through the trees. "Cross at the bridge," said Stubby Speck, "and you won't have to cross here and get wet." "Mr. Speck," said Granny Little, "will you keep the knitted baskets as presents from us?" "I sure will, ma'am. Thank you kindly," said Mr. Speck. "My missus will love those baskets. Old skunk waddles a bit too much for her. She has a hard time staying on him." The Littles thanked Mr. Speck. Everyone shook his hand. Mr. Speck took off his hat and bowed. Then he mounted his skunk, and in a few moments he was out of sight. Well, that's exciting. They got to meet other Littles.
Restart.
Thank you, Josiah.